memorial to Joe McManus upon the occasion of his death.
Well then, Frank, now, how many children do you have?
7.
So, as well as having 7 children and a full-time teaching job, you find time to have produced 4 books since 1973. And in addition to that, that's just the beginning of his activities. I've got down here, Frank, that you also produce a magazine.
Yes, we have a monthly publication called The Great Lakes Fisherman, which goes to commercial fishermen all over the Great Lakes. It's a monthly publication, and this really gives my family an opportunity to do a lot of work. The children help with the mailing and so on.
Where's your farthest customer?
California. We have 2 subscribers in California. Some in strange states. Kentucky. We have 2 in Kentucky and Massachusetts. And we have 1 in England.
1 in England.
Yes. So.
Well, why would the people in California? I suppose there'd be people who've been from Port Stanley or had done fishing on the Great Lakes.
The name is Chafee, and just the other day I ran across the same name in connection with some fisheries, I think on Lake Michigan. So
I see.
I suspect that that's the connection.
Yeah. Now, is that the only magazine you put out?
It's the only magazine, but we have another tabloid publication, the Port Stanley Beacon, which comes out twice a month. It is the local paper in Port Stanley.
Now, also, as well as his publishing career, Frank organized the convention of the Great Lakes Fishermen. How many years have you held that?
We've held it 3 years in a row at Port Stanley. The last 2 years, the Elgin Fishermen's Association have sponsored it, and it attracts commercial fishermen from all over the Great Lakes. It's the only occasion in the year when they can really all get together, and I don't know about its future next year. It may move to another port, but I suspect it'll be back in Port Stanley, and we'll be running it again.
It's terribly difficult to get someone to do all the organization work that lies behind organizing a successful convention. Now, also, Frank, just recently you've been involved with the 50th anniversary of Arthur Bowden Secondary School. And could you say a little bit about that? I'm sure a lot of people in St. Thomas, a lot of people who are watching the program were at that reunion.
Yes, about 6 or 8 months ago, we began to realize that we were getting very close to the 50th anniversary of the school, and so we attempted to organize a program which consisted of an open house, first of all at the school, where we made presentations in the auditorium, the band and choir and so on, had all the schoolrooms functioning, and some old pictures of the school available for the ex-students to see. And on Friday night, we reinstituted night football in St. Thomas at Pinafore Park, and it was a tremendous success. And Saturday night, we had a banquet and dance at the Store Club, which we were also quite pleased with. The whole program seemed to have gone off rather smoothly, so we were very pleased with that.
Well, I've heard a lot of good comments about the thing that caught my attention about the reunion is that you uncovered the cornerstone of the building, and I'd like you to say a little bit about that. 50 years after the building's built, we find the cornerstone at a house next door, eh?
Yeah, I seem to be stumbling on mysteries all the time because we still haven't learned for sure why the cornerstone was never laid, but it laid at a house across the street for 50 years, just beside the house, and we've come up with various stories. One of them is that the people who contracted to build the school lived across the street or boarded there temporarily, and that they had the cornerstone over there and never got around to laying it. A more plausible one, which I heard today, is that the premier of the province was to lay the stone, and he couldn't come because he didn't dare attend a public function at that moment. He had just introduced 4.4 beer during the middle of Prohibition, and the temperance people were out to lynch him. So he thought he'd better remain in Toronto, and therefore the stone never got laid.
Who was the premier then?
I've got to check up on that because it never, until today, I'd never had reason to question that.
You just heard that story today?
Yes.
Well, it sounds reasonable. That's, that was 1926.
Right.
And that was the year they introduced 4.4 beer after total Prohibition.
Mm-hmm.
And so he didn't want to commute through a public function because, well, St. Thomas, I suppose St. Thomas was a fairly dry area, and he was afraid there'd be a public demonstration against him.
I understand there were public demonstrations over the 4.4 beer, so at least if he didn't want to show his face in public, I imagine he had other things to occupy his mind at the time, at any rate, rather than laying the cornerstone.
Well, now, there's also another story you were telling me that Arthur Bowden, who was a medical doctor, wasn't he?
Yes, and the principal at STCI,
yes.
And he apparently fought the idea of naming the school after himself. He was quite displeased about that, so he would have had no reason to proceed with the ceremony of laying a cornerstone when it was going to be named after himself, and he didn't approve of that.
Yes, that's one of the few schools in St. Thomas that's named after somebody, isn't it? But he really pioneered and fought very hard to establish a vocational school in St. Thomas. It was one of the first in the province.
Yes, there's no doubt that the school was something new, particularly in southwestern Ontario, and it was visited many times by other areas after that that wanted to establish technical schools.
And it's had a long series of very excellent principals.
Yes.
Yes. That school. Well, Frank, perhaps we better get on to Port Stanley and the Bessemer. How would you like to do this? Do you want to give them the background of the coal trade first, or?
I thought we might talk about the variety of boat itself first, if that's all right. And for that, I was wondering if we could use a picture or a series of pictures. This one first, if we can get the camera in on it. And the type of boat is quite vital to the whole story here. And the Marquette Bessemer is a car ferry, which replaced the boats that had to be unloaded by hand. Previous to this time, boats coming into Port Stanley had to be unloaded by stevedores with a wheelbarrow, and unloading coal in that way took a very long time. The Marquette Bessemer replaced that type of boat and preceded the self-unloader that we know today, which has its own unloading equipment. And the principle of the Marquette and Bessemer was to load railway cars on the back.
We have another picture here showing that.
Now this...
how many railroad cars could they get on a ship like that?
This boat could hold 30 cars. There were 2 tracks on either side, and each held about 15 railroad cars. They were normally filled with coal from the Pennsylvania coal fields. The boat would be loaded at Conneaut and brought to Port Stanley. And this picture shows that at Port Stanley, the old slip dock was called the old slip dock, and you can see an LMPS locomotive on the other side right here, an LMPS locomotive pushing the railroad cars into the hold of the ship where they were locked down with a key and chain. And,
can I ask you a question while you're on it? So these cars are filled with coal in Conneaut, Ohio, is it? And then they came to Port Stanley, and those coal cars would be taken off by the LMPS or the Marquette, who owned it then, and taken to London and so on. Now, would just empty cars would be going back, would they?
There was some trade backward across the lake, but generally speaking, she'd be running empty going back. There'd be some grain and a few odd things like that. The Marquette and Bessemer carried a more varied sort of cargo than did her sister ship, the Marquette and Bessemer No. 1. It carried only coal cars. Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 sometimes carried railroad wheels or whatever other products were needed here that had to come in from the United States. Here's another picture of the... This is a stern view of the Marquette and Bessemer loaded. There you can see a railroad car on either side from the back, and you can see that the boat is open at the back to allow for the loading of the railroad cars aboard the boat.
Can I just say something for the viewers while we're on that? If they look at that back end, now there were chains that went across there and held the cars in. Were there?
Yes, and there was each car was individually locked down as well. There's never any record of them breaking loose other occasions. And this variety of boat was used very widely on the Great Lakes, particularly on Lake Michigan. They were less successful on Lake Erie. They didn't last quite as long down here because the railroads could compete pretty well by going around the lake. But Lake Michigan, it's very narrow, 70 or 80 miles across and hundreds of miles around it, so they're much more popular up there. The Marquette and Bessemer was 350 feet long, so for the year she was built, which was 1905, that was a rather large boat. If we look back to 1906, the following year, the British built the Dreadnought, and she was only a couple hundred feet long, longer than the Marquette and Bessemer. So for that period, the Marquette and Bessemer is a big boat.
A Dreadnought was a battleship,
yeah.
assuming.
Yes, the famous British battleship, which sort of revolutionized sea warfare. It wasn't all that much bigger than the Marquette and Bessemer.
No. Now, what were the dimensions of it again, the length?
She was 350 feet long and 54 feet wide, which is a fairly wide beam for that early a boat. Boats tended to have rather narrow beams in those days. She drew 14 feet of water when loaded and had triple expansion steam engines. That meant that they were able to get use out of the steam 3 times over. The steam would push one piston and then go into another chamber and push another piston and so on. So it was quite efficient. It had 2 propellers. And I don't know the exact tonnage offhand, but she's a fairly substantial boat for the turn of the century. The best they could build at the time, no doubt about it.
Well, now, both the Bessemer 1 and the Bessemer 2 are the same, roughly the same design. What happened to the first Bessemer boat?
The Marquette and Bessemer, this gets very confusing. The Marquette and Bessemer number 1 was a similar boat, but smaller and with a lower profile. She had less superstructure than the number 2. The number 1 went about its business for a good many years, going primarily to Rondeau. It only came to Port Stanley occasionally. The Marquette and Bessemer number 2 was launched in 1905 and ran a regular route from Conneaut to Port Stanley daily and return. And it lasted until 1909 when it disappeared, and it was replaced by the Marquette and Bessemer number 2. That's where it all gets confusing, because she's replaced by a boat of exactly the same name, dimensions, size. There's only one distinction between the 2 boats. And the Marquette and Bessemer number 2 goes on for a good many years afterwards, plying its trade across Lake Erie without incident, as far as I know.
And you say it made this trip daily?
Yes.
As it came from Conneaut to Port Stanley in one day and back the next, or it make both trips the same day?
It could, I don't know to be sure, but it was capable of making the trip there and back in a single day. The boat could do 12 miles an hour loaded, and it's a little over 60 miles to Conneaut, which means a 5-hour trip. So the real question would be the loading, how long it took them to load, and how frequently the traffic was going back and forth. It was very heavy traffic, as it probably would be in the summertime. Then they could easily make 2 trips a day.
At the same time that this was running, you also had the passenger ferries to Cleveland and...
Yes, the Marquette and Bessemer did very little passenger business, although it was willing to take passengers back and forth. It had a rate for it and rooms for them. But the Conneaut's not a port that commands a lot of that kind of service.
No.
Most of the passenger boats would be going to Cleveland and larger centers.
Well, I don't know whether this perhaps... rumor has it that these boats were rough travelers on the water. Is that, does your research substantiate that?
Yes, particularly this one, the Marquette and Bessemer number 2, and I would therefore think its successor, the Marquette and Bessemer number 2 that followed it. Both were unpopular with the men who sailed them and seem to have been a little unstable in heavy seas. I don't know whether that's a characteristic of the whole breed or not, because you could find these running on Lake Michigan right up to the mid-50s and early 60s. They were still going back and forth across Lake Michigan, and they seem to have no troubles up there to speak of. I don't think they may have lost one or two of them over a span of 75 years, but that's not a bad record.
No, not bad when you consider the number of wrecks in the Great Lakes. Perhaps this would be a place to say something. I had an interesting conversation yesterday and found out that Charlie Smale, who was the superintendent of the Chesapeake in Ohio, and been retired for a number of years and is presently in the Memorial Hospital, worked on the, now it may have been the Bessemer 1 or the Bessemer 2, he was just a young boy, about 14 or 15, and he described one trip coming from Conneaut in a storm, and he said that all the chains around the back broke except one, and that the railway tracks were twisted on the deck of the boat. The boat had been tossed around so much. Everybody was scared stiff during the trip. When they got to port, they all quit, except Charlie Smale, and he was just a young boy, and the captain talked him into making the return trip. And he did, and I think he made a few more trips, and then he left Bessemer and got a job on another boat, and then eventually got into the railroad service. But he still remembers how terrible it was in some of those storms, and how scared everybody was. And even I suppose if the cars were all locked down and so on, you'd still have a feeling that it was a big tub, eh?
It's I rather suspect that at least a percentage of the crews of the Marquette and Bessemers were always transient. Yeah. We read of at least 2 or 3 of the crew, one that I know you're familiar with, who had plans to leave it, and this was going to be their last trip in 1909, and it did turn out to be their last trip, unfortunately.
Well, I thought maybe we'd save that story while we go on. Now, is there anything else we should maybe have in the background of leading up to this tragedy when it was lost?
The one feature of the Marquette and Bessemer in terms of its structure was the lack of a stern gate, which was unusual. Most of them did have a stern gate. The sister ship, which was older, had a stern gate. The successor had a stern gate, and others that I've seen on the Upper Lakes had stern gates. Why the company bothered to save $1,000 or so in construction by not putting it in, I don't know. The speculation was that they felt that if a storm did arise, they could head the boat into the waves, and that there would be no opportunity of it being swamped from behind.
No, I'm not very nautical, Frank, and I'm sure some of the audience aren't too nautical either. Now, what is a stern gate at...
Perhaps we could go back to a picture. Would that be possible?
Yes, and
if we can put that on there, we can show quite clearly the lack of a stern gate.
Yeah.
Now, this is the Marquette and Bessemer number 2, and you can see the railroad cars. Now, as I say, it's very difficult to distinguish whether you're talking about the first or second Marquette and Bessemer number 2 from photos, and I suspect this photo is the replacement, and that these sort of white structures you see at the back here are, in fact, the gates, which could be extended right across the back. At any rate, the Marquette and Bessemer was entirely open at the back. There was nothing to prevent the waves coming aboard there at all. And that, after the disaster, that became a topic of conversation concerning her sinking, of course.
That's the thing, is if the wind was following you and you had big waves, the boat could perhaps be swamped or thrown off balance by the water coming over the stern now.
Yes, and when we're talking about the men aboard not being very happy with the boat prior to its disappearance, even the captain had confided to his brother. He had quite a few brothers, and they were all captains of lake boats. And he confided to his brother Hugh that he had just about lost her in a storm once, and that this idea of pointing her into the waves didn't work, because when she was into one wave, her stern would be down, and she could, even though the sea wasn't following, the waves or the water could pour in over that rear deck. And she had 4 hatch covers in the interior where the railroad cars were, and 2 of them were never closed because they were for bunkering with coal, and so the covers were never on those. And then the 2 others only had wooden covers, which could be floated away at a moment's notice.
Well, perhaps maybe I to tell this story, that I must apologize to one of my viewers if she's watching. A lady in Port Stanley phoned me last year and gave me some of these details, and I carefully wrote down her name and phone number, and I was going to go and see her, and I've been looking for the note ever since, which gives you some idea of my record keeping. But they knew one of the crew members, Walter, Harry Thomas.
Yes.
And he was the brother of Neil J. Thomas and a sister of Mrs. W.R. Cavanaugh, whose husband was principal of Arthur Bowden for a long time. And Harry Thomas was a crewman on it, and while the Bessemer was in port on its second last trip, according to her, he visited the family, and he spent the whole evening talking about his dislike of the Bessemer and his anxieties about the boat, and he'd made up his mind he was going to quit the next trip, after the next trip. And then he said goodnight. He had to go and report to the boat. I guess it was going on its way to Cleveland. So he walks out of the door, and he's standing on the veranda, and he just stopped and stood there for a long time without saying anything. And then he said this very strange remark, "I miss my sister very much." And the lady, then he didn't say anything more. He walked away into the darkness towards the boat. And the lady said, well, it was the strangest thing because her sister died a number of years before. And it just seemed like kind of a non sequitur to bring that in there. And she feels he sort of had a premonition that perhaps he was going to join his sister. And that's what happened, of course, because he made the trip back to Conneaut, and then on the next trip over, the boat was lost. Now, perhaps we better go on from there and get into the actual details of the Bessemer.
It's amazing, though, before we do go on to that, how many Great Lakes disasters are surrounded by all of these almost extrasensory perception things. And some of them are difficult to believe afterwards and difficult to authenticate. But one of the men aboard the Marquette and Bessemer was from Mount Clemens, Michigan. And he had written a letter to his parents who lived in Saginaw saying, "This is my last trip. This boat is unsafe." They have the letter, the actual documentation there. "I'm leaving the boat. It's my last trip. She's totally unsafe." And, of course, he's never heard from again. But, yes, to get on to the actual story.
You know, I suppose perhaps people who sail, it's such an elemental thing. We forget, don't we? You know, we lead such sort of safe and secure lives. We really sort of forget what it's like on a pitching boat out in Lake Erie, and perhaps they become extra sensitive. I don't know. I am a great believer in such things as extrasensory perception, and but maybe their occupation perhaps makes them that way. Of course, also sailors are always telling tall stories, aren't they?
Yeah. We have a little diagram here showing Lake Erie. If it can be, perhaps we can tell the story, the main part of it, using the outline of Lake Erie here. And here we have Conneaut marked on the map, and Erie, Pennsylvania, which figures in the story, and Port Stanley. We should actually move Port Stanley over a little bit here to where it belongs, but at any rate, we have these locations, and here's Long Point, and here's Rondeau, which is also going to figure in the story. Now, the Marquette Bessemer leaves Conneaut on December the 7th, 1909, headed for its regular run to Port Stanley. It is 2 hours or 3 hours late getting away because a rather brisk wind has come up, and there's an ore boat being tied up for the winter, and its hawsers have been broken loose. And, of course, they have to get it tied down before there's any traffic in and out. The Marquette and Bessemer number 1 leaves about 6:30 in the morning, and about 4 hours later, the boat we are interested in gets out. At command of the boat is Captain Robert McLeod, who's from Kincardine, and there's no more respected captain on the lakes. And his brother, who is also holds captain's papers, is second mate. He preferred a steady run back and forth across the lake where he could get home frequently and so on, to being captain of his own boat and having to traipse all over the lakes. So we have the Marquette and Bessemer number 2 leaving Conneaut in a stiff 50-mile-an-hour wind. and about 42 degrees of temperature. Nobody can prove that it was ever seen again, although we have sightings thereafter that are interesting and contribute to the story. There's a fisherman out here, a man named Snyder, and the Snyders are still in the fishing industry over there. He's coming in on his boat, and he sees the Marquette and Bessemer, but she seems to be making good time and no problems. When he gets in, the temperature's dropped to 10 degrees above zero, and the wind's gone up to 70 miles an hour, and he had considerable ice on his boat. So we can only imagine that in the next 5 or 6 hours crossing the lake, that the Marquette and Bessemer certainly had no easy ride. The next we hear of her, she is sighted at Port Stanley about between 5 and 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And she is sighted by the customs officer, who must have known her very well since he would have to see it every day. It would be getting dark by 5 to 6 o'clock, but he saw the lights, he saw the outline clearly, and he saw her turn to the west. She couldn't make the harbor. Port Stanley Harbor is relatively narrow for a boat that size, and in a storm it would be very difficult to make. So he sees it turn to the west, presumably to try and make Rondeau, which would be good seamanship. The Marquette and Bessemer is sighted again later in a whole lot of places, and this creates the problems. The customs officer sights it again at 3 a.m. in the morning, sounding distress signals off here. So we are now into Wednesday morning that he sights it again. And he hears the whistle and he sees the boat, but the direction is uncertain. At the same time, there is a boat lying off of Conneaut here that could not get into the harbor because of the storm. It was a very, very vicious storm. And the crew of this boat say they sighted the Marquette and Bessemer at 1:30. And there is someone a little further down the lake here who also swears at Fairview, which is just outside of Erie, Pennsylvania. They say they sighted her around 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning as well. And so we've got a problem. We've got her on both sides of the lake at the same time. Beyond that,
Can I just review that for a minute? Okay. It leaves Conneaut about what time again?
10:30.
10:30 in the morning.
Right.
And now it's very rough seas, and it isn't going to make that good time.
Right.
So the customs officer at port spots it off Port Stanley between 5 and 6 o'clock that afternoon.
Right.
And then, because the water's so rough, it can't take a chance of trying to get into that narrow harbor. And he says, turn to the west, which the wind was blowing, the wind is blowing from the west.
Right.
So he's turned it into the wind, which should take care of that thing at the back, the lack of a stern gate, and tried to make Rondeau. Now, the customs officer then says he heard it again at 3 a.m.
Right. And there is a man at Port Bruce, unidentified, but in the records, the newspapers and so on, he claims to have heard her within about a half an hour of the same time, and he was familiar with her signals. She was blowing four blasts of the whistle repeatedly. Going to Rondeau would have been the reasonable thing, the smart thing to do at the moment, because Rondeau is the harbor into which the other Marquette and Bessemer went.
Yep.
And it's behind Point O'Pines here. Actually, you have to go around Point O'Pines to get into it, but you have good weather in behind the point.
Yep.
So he'd have a little bit of a breathing spell there. And obviously he doesn't want to turn her with her stern to those waves. This is an unusual storm on Lake Erie. Lake Erie storms traditionally last 2 or 3 hours, 5 hours, or 8. This one raged for the better part of a week. In fact, we're not going to be positive of what happened to the Bessemer until Sunday. And it's on Tuesday that she leaves port.
This is Tuesday it left. Now, can I just go back once again? So we've got at 3 a.m. the man at port, and within a half an hour of that, a man at Port Bruce, who knew the whistle, and would recognize it, say they heard it. But at the same time, at 1:30 in the morning, there are a couple of references over on the south side of the lake that say they saw it. Is that what they say? They saw it? Or they
Yes, this boat here actually saw it. This was a lady over here, a farm lady, and they put out a light because the boat was coming in towards the shore, and so they put up a light to warn her that it was coming near shore. And I would think this one is the most suspect of them all. This one I don't know about. There are other boats. This is a busy shore along here. There are other boats around, but she has a very distinct profile. So you're left
well, you
with,
think men who were sailors on that boat at Conneaut or off the harbor would know, but that'd make a. It's almost. It can't be in both places. It can't possibly have gone there.
If he, in fact, did run down towards Rondeau, he would find that he couldn't get into Rondeau. The weather got worse instead of better. He's a long way from the lee of the islands down here.
Yes.
He wouldn't have a lot of choice. He'd probably have to run for the South Shore. But the contradictory part of that is, why would he go to Conneaut, which has a very, very small harbor? It's worse than Port Stanley to get into. When Erie, he can get around behind Presque Isle and get in there, or he could have gone to Cleveland. So ultimately, I sort of favor that one back there, that he ran up the shore here a little ways, found that he couldn't get anywhere, and that he turns, because as a mariner, the ultimate solution to his problem is back here behind Long Point.
Yes.
Whenever there's a storm, you get behind Long Point to get in the lee of that point.
That's a historic sanctuary, isn't it, that every ship in trouble. Right. No, this lady of Port Stanley, who I must apologize to again, whose name I've forgotten, also says that at 3 o'clock in the morning they heard the whistle at the Bessemer.
Yes, I'm sure it's Mrs. Agnes Smith who told you the story, because I've talked to her about it, and she remembers her mother coming down in the morning and saying that she was glad the Bessie had got in because they'd heard the whistle, but what they'd heard was the whistle blowing offshore. Incidentally, the other Marquette and Bessemer, number 1, went into Port Stanley because he couldn't make it to Rondeau. It got too rough, and so it was already in there.
And he got in
the slip dock. Yeah, he made it in before things got too bad. So,
well, we assume he went to Rondeau and couldn't make it, and then what do you think happened then?
I suspect that he turned and came back up to try and get into Long Point. That in coming back, he may have come closer to the shore to try and get the lee of the shore a little bit. But at any rate, he's headed back towards Long Point. I think ultimately we have to get him out here somewhere. I think that is where she lies at the moment. But it's going to be very difficult to prove. There was great dismay in Conneaut. Strangely, the dismay at her disappearance in Conneaut came right away. The next day they started saying, "Where is she?" Now, it wasn't unusual for the Marquette and Bessemer to be gone 4 days in bad weather, and she might have laid up anywhere. And this was before wireless on the lakes, and they wouldn't have any way of knowing where she was. One time she was gone 10 days behind Long Point. Laid over there 10 days for weather, and it's strange that they should get excited so soon. And the company kept putting the people off and saying, "Oh, everything's all right. This isn't unusual." But it was unusual. 2 other boats were lost on Lake Erie during that storm on the same night of the 7th. One down at this end and one up at this end. And the loss of life was fairly heavy. And there was a lot of other damage. A very severe storm.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question here? Now, when the captain turned around there, he couldn't make Rondeau. Now, he must have realized that he was caught between the devil and the deep blue sea, because he's now turning his boat around with that rear end without a stern gate exposed to that wind and following waves. In my experiences with canoes, that's a dangerous position in a canoe. I suppose it is in a big boat, too.
The principle's the same.
He must have felt he had to do that, eh?
Once Captain McLeod gets to Point O'Pines, he's beat, and he must have known it. You know, it must have, if indeed he did go that way, and there's reason to believe he did, then when he got there, he must have his heart must have just sunk right to his feet, because it was going to be game over. There were very few chances of him getting out of the predicament with the boat he had in his hands. The next day is the 8th, and a boat which had traveled down Lake Erie that night reported having run through some wreckage somewhere off Long Point, about 35 miles off Long Point, so out in this area somewhere. And he never stopped for some strange reason. I suppose the storm was bad enough that he couldn't, but he never investigated it at all, and he went on to Buffalo. And nothing is found to confirm her disappearance or anything else until the following Sunday. Although the Marquette Bessemer number 1 is sent out and it searches the whole coast all the way around, finds no wreckage, finds no evidence of the Marquette and Bessemer at all. She's just disappeared. Then, on the Sunday, we have the first piece of concrete evidence. A few miles off of Erie on this side, a lifeboat is found by the patrol vessel of the state of Pennsylvania, which was run by Captain Driscoll. They're an old fishing family from back there. And the Captain Driscoll found a lifeboat here from the Marquette and Bessemer No. 2 with 9 men in it frozen to death, and the clothing of a 10th man who evidently had gone mad, taken off his clothes and jumped overboard, which is unusual behavior in panic circumstances.
So there's nine bodies.
9 bodies.
9 frozen bodies. And one man taking his clothes off in a panic. That's real tragedy, isn't it? You'd think, you'd be surprised at that boat, a lifeboat, being able to survive in that rough water, eh?
It had air tanks. It was almost submerged. It was in very bad condition, but it, in fact, was still floating. The 9 bodies were brought to Erie, and the 2 Port Stanley boys, Harry Thomas and Ray Hines, were amongst those, and their bodies were brought back, and they're buried at Union. One of the ironic and interesting things about the Marquette and Bessemer is when she left Conneaut on December the 7th, she was supposed to have a passenger, and he never showed up. And they were just pulling away, and he came running up with his briefcase in his hand, and they had to back up the motors, and he jumped aboard. And he was from Erie, Keystone Fish Company. He was the treasurer of the Keystone Fish Company. His name was Weiss. That was a fairly large fish company. And he was coming to Port Stanley to buy out a fish company, and he had $50,000 in cash in the briefcase. And that has always been an intriguing part of it. If she's there, the cash is still there, and it's recoverable, probably. But
that's really ironic that he had to rush to make the boat, and the boat backed up. He should have thanked God he missed it, really.
There was a man named Lawrence, who was also a Port Stanley boy on the other side, who had been sent out while she was on the Port Stanley side, and her second last run then. He'd been sent out to see if he could find some more men for the black gang, for the shoveling coal. And he met his girlfriend and sort of went his own way. And then he heard the ship's whistle, and he ran down, and the boat had already left. And he thought, well, I'd missed some work anyway. But it saved his life.
Now, there's no, outside of those men being frozen, the captain's not among them. And when's the next... was the passenger wasn't found in any of those?
No, the passenger was never found. 14 bodies are found in all, not including the passenger. The other intriguing point about the lifeboat is the men were clad rather poorly for winter. They had no coats on. But in the bottom of the lifeboat were 2 butcher knives and a cleaver, which raises the question, if a man is going to head for a lifeboat, why doesn't he grab a jacket rather than these utensils? The steward from the galley was one of the men in the boat. Okay, so we have the lifeboat found, and then a lifeboat at Port Burwell, east of Port Stanley, a lifeboat there, and the remains of a second one, just the air tanks. So that takes care of 2 lifeboats. In another couple of weeks, another lifeboat at Buffalo.
For heaven's sake.
So we're getting things spread all over the map here. Right? And that takes care of all 4 lifeboats. She had only 4 lifeboats. And since these ones here had never been used at all, the oars were with them, there was no paint off the oars or the oar locks, so they'd never been used at all. The suspicion was that she might have gone down on her side, making it impossible to use 2 of them. And so that they attempted to use one. Nobody knows what happened there, and then the one that was found. So that takes care of that. The remaining evidence that comes up is Captain McLeod, Captain John McLeod, who was the first mate, is found in the Niagara River when the men are sweeping ice away from the hydro channels there, keeping the ice from plugging them up. This body comes up, and it turns out to be Captain McLeod. A couple of other bodies come up at Long Point, and the last one to come up is Captain Robert McLeod, the captain of the boat, commanding officer, and his body comes up there the following year on October the 5th, so it's almost a year to the day that it comes up, or that it's found there. And it bears, allegedly, slash marks.
From the butcher knives in the boat that found over at Erie, eh?
That is the conjecture,
Yeah.
and that is why that is one of the mysterious aspects of the Marquette and Bessemer. Is were the butcher knives actually used in some sort of mutiny? Was he? They wanted him to do something and he wouldn't do it, and a fight ensued. The suggestion that they were fighting over getting into a lifeboat, most people at the time wouldn't buy it. They said McLeod was just too good a man, that he would make sure that everybody else was in the lifeboats first.
Yes.
He was an officer of the old school, and but in a panic condition.
Panic people act strangely, don't they? When they're scared. Well, that's really fascinating. That now you're 9 men in the lifeboat. One man comes up at Buffalo. That's 10. And then 2 bodies at Long Point?
Yes, the captain and the engineer. Both
that's 12. Yeah.
And the other 2 are in the Long Point area as well.
They were there too.
Yeah. So we have a sort of scattergram in which all the evidence is spread out over the eastern end of Lake Erie. But subsequent attempts to investigate the mystery, there's been all sorts of people who have found the Marquette and Bessemer at various times, allegedly, and nobody has ever proven it. One of the things that is wrong is that the Marquette and Bessemer is 14 feet draft, and then at least 35 feet or 40 feet of freeboard, which makes it a very deep sort of ship.
Yeah.
And it is also 54 feet wide. So whichever way you put this boat down, on its side or straight down, it would have to almost stick out of the water anywhere in this part of Lake Erie.
Yep.
Because Lake Erie is so shallow, it's very difficult to find 75 feet of water out there in this
that center part. Eh?
The only place that's really deep is the big holes off of Long Point there. But nonetheless, there are some big wrecks out here, and it may very well be one of them. There is the one school of opinion that she's down here, right off Long Point. There's another that feels she's up here towards Rondeau because there is a wreck up that way. The Americans are sort of convinced she's over here.
Over on that side.
But the one that makes sense to me is that she's out in there somewhere, because then with a west wind blowing, you get a lot of wreckage up here on the point and right around the Port Burwell. You get some men who get out in a lifeboat and row a little bit and catch Lord knows what currents or winds, and they end up off Erie, but that's 5 days later. That's on Sunday, and she sank probably on Wednesday morning early. And then you get some going right on down the lake. And to get all that sort of disposition of evidence, it would seem to me that she has to be out there somewhere towards the center of the lake.
Frank, there's a man, a professor of yours down at, Bowling Green?
Yes.
And he must subscribe to the view that the Bessemer's on the South Shore, because didn't he go to the trouble of getting the salvage rights for it?
Yes, he had the salvage rights for it. I don't know whether it was for a particular wreck they had over there. I guess it was a particular wreck, and you have to make some attempt to tell the government what it is that you're diving after. So you guess that it's such and such a boat, and they give you salvage rights or don't give them, and or the diving rights. And so he must have subscribed to that. But he was, when I phoned him about the discovery that a fisherman made there, which we can talk about in a moment, about a year and a half ago, he was quite convinced that our evidence coincided with the facts, and that that is where she really is.
Well, now tell me about the year and a half ago. That's when the Bessemer was in the news with. You just tell the story, Frank. Or
the Marquette and Bessemer, unlike a lot of other boats on the lake, she has a tremendous following, which. The printing of the article of this discovery of the fishermen aroused all sorts of interest, because this boat followed a regular route and everybody knew her. Now, other boats, they come and go and you don't really get any attachment to them. So there was a tremendous attachment to the Marquette and Bessemer. And about a year ago, a little over a year ago, a fisherman in Port Stanley, Captain Larry Jackson, who has a twin diesel fishing tug there, the GW Jackson. He lives in Port Dover and fishes out of Port Stanley. He drives back and forth most of the time. And he was fishing with gill nets. He will not say exactly where.
No, I don't blame him.
And his nets became snagged, and he got them free, but he was kind of interested in it, and I understand he set the nets in the same place again. And the second time, they really became snagged on whatever was down there. And he had a very good depth recorder, and he turned his depth recorder on, and he got a reading on this boat, and it would appear from the depth recording that she's about 350 feet long, a fairly large boat. And he got a piece of the railing from the boat up as well. And so we took the railing, and we took the photographs of the Marquette and Bessemer, and they match. Even to the height, it was a rather low rail. And you can see in some of the pictures there that the rail only comes up just above the knees of the men on the boat, and that's about how high this railing is. And he tore it loose from the boat using his puller. They had to put an extra strain on it to get it up, and you could tell that it had broken loose because there were fresh breaks in the metal. In fact, the metal was in surprisingly good condition, other than being covered with a little bit of mud. And his conjecture was immediately that it was the Bessemer. And looking at the rail, and I know that he fishes. There's no secret about that. I know that he fishes roughly the middle of the lake, well out, maybe 25 or 30 miles out. That's not telling any secrets, because if anybody wants to go out there and look, they're going to be a long time looking. He has radar bearings on it, and I was talking to him earlier today, and he is going to put a diver down on it in the spring. And he's going to try and, first of all, prove his point that it really is the Marquette and Bessemer number 2.
Now, if he can get a diver down, does he have salvage rights to that, or?
No, the law is very strange on that. They will give you diving rights, and you must bring it up, whatever you have there, bits or pieces or whatever. You must show it to the government, and then apply for your salvage rights. You must have something in hand to show them. You can't just get salvage rights blanket on something that's lying down there. Now, the receiver of wreck has already sent us a letter saying that the Queen has no interest. I don't know whether he consulted her personally or not, but at any rate, the government has no interest if it is the Marquette and Bessemer number 2. And therefore, he has exclusive diving rights at the moment, and anything he does bring up there, the government has already stated, really, that it will withdraw its interest, and so he'll be able to keep it.
Well, I wish him luck. I hope he can find that $25,000, but even if he can't find that, there are a great number of other things that would be of immense value for antique collectors and nautical buffs, I assume, eh?
Yes, if he can, I would think the wheel off it, if they could get the wheel off it, if it's still there, would be worth $1,000 or so from some collector. But I think one of his primary motives, and certainly my primary interest in it, would be just to find out where she went, and perhaps how she went down. There's one theory that the cars broke loose, ran off the stern, and turned her over. And of course, the other theory, which is probably more plausible, as you mentioned earlier, is her being swamped from behind by a following sea, and the water going down through the hatches.
Well, it would certainly be fascinating if he can find the exact answer to a mystery that's been a mystery since 1909, and I know that some people thought the Bessemer was way over at Rondo and beyond, didn't they? And it really would be satisfying to you as a historian if they could pin it down and say, well, this is it, and it sank at that particular spot, and but would never be able to solve the mystery of whether there was a mutiny or whether somebody attacked the captain, or whether somebody just went berserk with the carving knives. And
Dr. Wright, whom we were mentioning earlier at the Great Lakes Research Center, is really fascinated by the whole project, and he has offered divers and their specialized equipment that they have, which they take paper, anything made of paper underwater, and the diver puts it in a container in water. They bring it to the surface very carefully and slap it into a freezer, and they freeze it. and then they freeze dry it like these coffee commercials.
Yes.
And they did this with the records of all the towns down through New York that were flooded in the floods a couple of years ago there, very successfully. So they can retain the paper.
So if any paper is brought up from that, they will be able to,
yes, they can preserve
such
it.
as the ship's log or anything like that might say something, eh? I think we're getting fairly close to the end of our program here, Frank.